Brighton Permaculture Trust, along with Low Carbon Trust, runs some courses in eco-building of various types. Ian, who's just leaving. Goodbye, Ian. So I'm not trying to get rid of you. Teaches a 3-day course in straw bale building. It tends to get booked up quickly, so if anyone's interested in that, the details are on our website. Mischa's here now from the Low Carbon Trust, and he's going to talk about eco-renovation, and we do a day course also in eco-renovation. It's actually one of our least popular courses, and it's not because Mischa teaches it. We've no idea why it's one of our least popular, because it should be one of our most popular, because there's so many properties that need renovating. Anyway, here's Mischa, and he can introduce himself more effectively than I can, and probably won't be as rude as me. Don't forget your button.
Yes, I am. Thank you. Hi, good morning. I'm Mischa from the Low Carbon Trust, and yes, I don't take it personally that this happens to be our least popular course. It is very strange because this is the one course that we offer that's probably the most widely applicable. All the other courses that we do are very good. They cover fantastic techniques and materials, but I would say that they have slightly less application than renovating the 25 million or so houses that we have in the UK, but there you go. This morning I'm going to quickly cover the subject of retrofit. It's quite a large subject, but I'm just going to focus on a couple of key areas really. We've been running an event in Brighton and Hove called Eco Open Houses since 2008, and from that we found that our guests, the people that come along and look around the houses, have 3 things that they're really interested in. One is, what can I do to my house to make it energy efficient? Secondly, is who can come along and actually do the work for me? And thirdly, how can I finance it? So I'm not going to really focus on local trades today. I'm just going to look really at the approach and what you can do to your house. And then I'm going to skip over and look at the finance options as well. And yeah, we can take it from there. I'm also going to cover a case study that we did locally. We've done quite a lot of projects locally, but this is quite a nice one because its budget is fairly modest at sort of 10 to 15,000, so it's something that's quite replicable. And from there I'll offer a few remarks as a conclusion. So I guess before I start, I'd just like to find out a little bit about the audience really, find out who you guys are. How many people here live in a retrofitted home? 1, 2, 3. Maybe this is a leading question, maybe I'm leading the audience. How many people here would like to live in a retrofitted home? Excellent. And finally, how many people would perhaps move or retrofit their home if they had around these sums of money to actually spend on their home, purely on energy efficiency, not on new kitchens or anything like that? Excellent, so about half to 2/3. That's very encouraging. So why retrofit? This is a little bit of a loaded slide in the sense that you could say that the left-hand column is negative things and the right-hand column is positive things. And it's not really meant to be like that, but perhaps at first glance or even second glance, it may come across like that. Really what I'm trying to get at here is that there's a number of different factors that can be improved by improving your home. So for example, if we consider environmentally your house, and what I mean by environmental, I mean the actual living conditions in your house. My flat, for example, is a beautiful flat built in, I think it was 1864-65, as part of a big Victorian villa. And actually it's not that cold and damp because it's a ground floor flat, but it is expensive to heat, and the atmosphere inside isn't as good as it could be. So I would say it's a little bit cold and damp. But the point is, internal environments tend to be more like that in normal houses that haven't really had any work done to them. And retrofitted houses on average tend to be warmer and crucially more comfortable. And what I mean by comfortable is warmer in winter and cooler in summer. So really just trimming off the extremes of temperature. And with cold, there are potential health issues. Below 15 degrees, if you live in an environment that is below 15 degrees, you potentially have impacts on your health. And the further that you go past that, the greater the impacts that are. And the World Health Organization has written extensively about that. I won't go into too much detail. But the point is, in a cold, damp home, there are potential health issues. In a warm, retrofitted, comfortable house, there aren't any. And this leads on again to the fact that in a normal house, it is typically that bills are a lot higher. I think on average fuel bills in the UK are around £1,400 a year, and this leads quite a large, I believe 1 in 4 people to be edging onto fuel poverty. And in a retrofitted house, they're cheaper to run because you don't need to use as much energy. The other thing I'd say about fuel poverty, there are some really quite alarming statistics as to excess winter deaths. And excess winter deaths are, if you look at the amount of people that die, people are dying all the time, people are being born all the time. But if you look at the average over the year, and you put in a seasonal variation, you can see that when the temperature drops, more people die. And very simply put, it's because of leaky, inefficient housing. And I actually, this morning, I had to look at the statistics for excess winter deaths last winter. And in actual fact, it's the lowest since records began in the early 1950s. But last winter, 13 to 14, just over 18,000 people died above and beyond the average for the rest of the year, purely due to poor, inefficient housing. And out of those 18,000 people, 14,000 of them were over 75, the others were over 65. So, I mean, really, it's just quite shocking that in a first world country, we can just have a segment of the population that really just quietly are just there, expiring in their houses every year, and very little is done about it. So fuel poverty is a very big, if not slightly invisible issue. Decreased capital value, it's not to say that a normal house is worth less, but there is evidence to say that a retrofitted house is worth more. And when energy performance certificates were first introduced in 2007, people were like, what are these funny things with an A to G rating and a rainbow grid down the side? But evidence from Australia, where they'd been introduced a while before, suggests that if you have the same houses next to each other, for every band that they are improved in energy efficiency performance, they're worth 3,000 Australian dollars more. So that's starting to trickle through now. The Department of Communities and Local Government did some research a couple of years ago, and for sure you could say, well, those are the guys that run energy performance certificates and all the legislation around it in this country, so perhaps it's a biased study. But they have seen, looking at the marketplace of houses being sold and resold, that actually there is an increased capital value for houses being retrofitted as well. And finally, I'd say that the sort of final benefit really is the fact that they are better for the environment. You are using less energy, less resources and less fuel and so on. So there's a feel-good factor there, and it's good to do your bit. So permaculture is all about patterns, and this is a very typical pattern of where heat is typically lost in a house. This is obviously a detached house, it's just a little diagram, but the patterns tend to be fairly similar. If it's a mid-terraced house, obviously you've got less walls, so you'd be losing less heat through those. But this is where the heat flows are. So the walls are quite a large amount, just over a third. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is walls tend to be quite poor performing. Environmentally, they conduct a lot of heat, but the other is they have a lot of surface area. Most buildings have a lot of walls. Some buildings have more than others, depending on the compactness of the form. Around a quarter of heat is lost through the roof. Windows is about 10%, floors about 15%, and drafts, that's just air, just flowing through the building in and out, is about 15%. So these are the areas really that we really want to try and tackle. So looking at another pattern, where is energy typically used? Well, these are figures for a typical 3-bedroom solid-walled house, but we can see just over 60% is used for space heating, probably a quarter is used for hot water, and then a tiny little bit for cooking, and the rest for lighting and appliances and TVs and things like that. This is an interesting slide. There's another set of statistics behind this, and if we look at the UK's total carbon emissions, something like 27% comes from domestic buildings, houses. Another 20% comes from non-domestic buildings. So actually buildings are almost 50% of the UK's carbon footprint on an annual basis. But 27% is from housing. And so looking at this figure, you can see that actually quite a large proportion of the UK's carbon footprint comes from the fact that people are heating their homes, and their homes are very, very inefficient. So it's just something to consider. But the key point from this slide really is these are all of the different things that we want to tackle. How we heat the space, how we provide hot water, cooking to a certain extent. There are lots of good low energy options for that, but also lighting and low energy appliances. So here's the approach really. And whenever I start to think about a project, the first thing I do, perhaps it's a throwback to my childhood, and I just enjoy picking up pens and crayons and colouring things in. But the first thing I always do is draw a line all the way around the property. and I start to think about all of those different areas and what is it that I can do at those points to insulate them and make them airtight. And ideally you want two lines really. You want a yellow one which shows where you're going to place your insulation, or indeed if there's insulation there, how you might improve it if it needs to be improved, and how you will make or increase the airtightness of the property. So you consider every floor, every wall and every roof and all the junctions in between, so that the heat flow is minimised through all of those. So the first thing we might typically do is insulate the loft. There's lots of other parts of the building that need insulating as well, but insulating a loft, particularly if your insulation is at the joist level, which is to say the horizontal level, is very easy to do. It's very cheap. You can do it yourself, in fact, very easily as well. The next is draft proofing, which is something else you can do very cheaply yourself, or you can pay someone else to do it. The next thing is thinking about efficient services, so in this case an efficient gas boiler. It has to be said that if you live somewhere with a gas main, having an efficient gas boiler is clearly the best thing to put in your property. That's not a particularly eco thing to say. I'm not saying burn more fossil fuel, it's a good thing to do, but the fact is when you start to compare it to all of the other options available, it makes the most sense. If you're not on the gas grid, so if you're a rural property or a high-rise block or something like that, there are lots of other options that may be better. But if you compare the price of mains gas to everything else, and indeed the actual cost of the capital cost of installing the equipment as well, it comes out pretty much on top every time. And obviously with a good efficient plant comes good efficient controls. It's good that you should be able to control your system locally in every single room. Every single radiator, if you've got a wet radiator system, should have a thermostatic radiator valve in it, which is what this is. Ideally you should have thermostats, ideally two at least in the property as well, and a programmer as well, so it enables you to deliver and control the heat in every single aspect and room of the property. Lagging all your pipes is really, really important, because the heat coming from the boiler to the radiators is just flowing into the property and it's not being controlled in the way that you want, so that's a good thing to do too. It can be quite cheap. And after that it starts to get a bit more expensive, so all of these things tend to be fairly low cost, although that probably cost you maybe £2,500. This is a building in Hanover that's been externally insulated on the walls, and that does tend to cost a little bit more. You're typically looking at about £100 a square metre for wall area for a solid wall property. Cavity wall insulation is a lot cheaper, but there can be issues along with that. Replacing the windows. Insulating the floor is very low down on the scale of things to do really. And finally, once you've done all of those things, if you have any money left, it's great to consider renewable energy, but probably not before. So here's the hierarchy of measures. Insulate, make airtight, adequate ventilation. Once you start to make a building airtight and stop the air just flowing through the building, you have to consider how you're going to provide fresh air in your building. Fresh air is an incredibly important thing for us to breathe, but also to remove toxicity and other things building up in the house and pollution. So it's very, very important to have adequate ventilation. When your house is drafty, you don't really have to think about these things in so much detail, but once you've made it airtight, it's very, very important. Then efficient controls, and finally renewable energy. The key thing here really is watching for trigger points. And what I mean by that is there's a number of times when you're doing things to your house, just general maintenance and so on, when you can do things just a little bit more and it's not really going to cost you very much. So for example, if you're going to externally insulate your house, it costs quite a lot of money just to have the scaffolding and everything else. It's an expensive thing to do. If on the other hand you're repairing all the render on your house because it's blown or it's cracked or whatever and it needs to be done, then actually the cost of just putting some insulation in whilst you're paying for all of the other work is very, very small really. It's a tiny consideration. Another trigger point, for example, if you're pulling up all your floorboards, you've got a suspended timber floor, you're pulling up all your floorboards and you're repairing them or replacing them, that's a great time to actually consider insulating under the floorboards. It's probably not worth doing at any other point because it's expensive and very invasive. So here's some quick wins. I'm not really going to sort of go on about these too much, other than I would say, never underestimate the power of a good set of curtains. Cheap measure, but it really can improve a room and make it a lot more comfortable very, very easily. Behaviour change is cheap, but it's difficult. Climate change is actually quite easy to deal with, but it's making people change that's difficult, and that's what makes climate change such a difficult thing to do. So finally, those are the things that we might like to do. How are we going to pay for them? Now, there's a number of different schemes, really, and they kind of divide out into things that provide you with an income, so you have to pay the capital up front for installing them. Things that you can get as loans. I'll talk a little bit about the Green Deal and mortgages as well. And there are some grants as well, and there's other things, reduced VAT, which is important to consider. Finance is a bit boring, but it's kind of important in the sense of it makes stuff happen. So feed-in tariff is purely there for electricity, and essentially you have to upgrade your house to a certain point, and then the government will pay you for energy that you generate. These figures are changing, they change every quarter, and indeed these figures actually end at the end of the month. They drop down slightly again. So you get paid a little bit for the energy, the electricity that you generate, and a little bit for exporting it as well. And it's paid over 20 years, so that can be quite a good thing to do. And same for renewable heat. So if you generate renewable heat in your property through solar thermal or through biomass or indeed a ground source heat pump, then the government will pay you money as well. But this is over a much shorter period. It's only over 7 years instead of 20. But there are some good amounts here for solar thermal. It's just over 19 pence per kilowatt hour of heat generated, and less of some of the others. Very high for ground source heat, but ground source heat pumps aren't generally that applicable for a lot of properties. I'm going to touch slightly on the Green Deal. The Green Deal is controversial for a number of reasons, and indeed it probably won't be with us for that much longer. It was very much, well, it was something that was originally, the scene was set for it under the Labour government in 2009, but obviously we had a Tory government in 2010, and it's, in a sense, it's been their baby, I guess, but there's been a lot of problems with it. But nevertheless, the fundamental principle is good, but the execution has been a little bit tricky. But the key point really is that it's a mapped retrofit journey. So it's difficult if you want to do something that's complicated. How do you go about doing it? And what I like about the Green Deal is the fact that it is a mapped journey. So you start very clearly with an assessment, you move on and consider how you'll pay for it. Somebody comes along who's accredited and installs stuff, and then finally it's paid for through the energy savings. And I think the pay-as-you-save model is a good model. It's just perhaps in this instance it hasn't been executed as well as it could be. But the other thing is the fact at the moment it is supported by a grant as well. So you can get quite good amounts of money towards stuff. And it's fairly simple how it works. Essentially you repay it through your energy bills, you have stuff installed, and the amount that it saves is the amount that you then use to pay back installing the measure in the first place. It has to be said, if you can avoid borrowing money, it's always better. But if you don't have savings and stuff, then it can be quite a good thing to do. The final thing I'd highlight to you is VAT. VAT is an incredibly boring subject, and I'm not going to spend too much time dwelling on it. But the key point is, for a lot of energy efficiency measures in houses, you should only be paying 5%. And we did a project. In fact, Duncan Baker Brown was the architect for it, and we were the contractor. And the entire project budget was about 172,000. And we did some very, very detailed analysis of the VAT on that project. As we were the contractor, it was something we needed to do, really. But through careful VAT treatment, we probably found about an extra £18,000 to £20,000 that we put back into that property instead of paying stuff over as VAT needlessly. So it is really, really important. And obviously you can't reclaim it as individuals, but you can get your contractors to pay less in the first place or charge you less. And the other thing with it is the fact that a lot of standard building work is payable at the full 20%. So you might have to get the work split out so that part of it is the work package is doing whatever it might be, fitting a new kitchen, bathroom, whatever, and the energy efficiency stuff is dealt with separately. But you can find 5% is a small amount, but 20% is a lot more, and it builds up very, very fast. So it's something to consider. Some things aren't included, boilers and glazing, and indeed architects' fees as well. So here's a case study of a property we did a few years ago. It's down in Lewis Road, built late 19th century. And it's a really lovely house, fairly sort of typical sort of terraced house, 3-bed, and fairly modest size. This is quite an early cavity wall here in this property. In fact, and it was hard to treat cavity. We had a surveyor come down and actually inspect it. And because we couldn't fill the cavity, we went for solid wall insulation, which is the only way that you can treat it, really. So we internally insulated at the front and externally insulated at the rear. And that was the bills prior to the installation and the estimated amount after. I have to say that the household, David, had actually done quite a lot to his house already. And the one thing he hadn't done is actually tackled the walls, because he didn't really feel very confident in that, because it was quite a sort of major intervention. But he had done quite a lot of other stuff. So it was quite good. It was quite good to actually be able to just put the final piece of the jigsaw in, really. And we also did some floor insulation, which I'll come back to in a second. There's lots of insulation turning up and being done internally. And you can see there that the corners, this is the window, and the corners there are chamfered, so it just lets the light a little bit more penetrating into the room. Here's the floor insulation. Usually it's quite difficult to insulate the floor, and as I said, it's good if you're replacing the floorboards, it's something to consider. But here there was quite a large subfloor void. I think it's about 1 metre, and there was a little access port just here, so we just dropped down and just filled it all with mineral fibre. So it's actually quite a cheap measure if you don't actually have to do very much to install it. So we snuck down in the basement and installed that and put some nice LED lighting in too. And that's the view of the back of the property. And that's the final sort of finishes inside. And you can see there the chamfered internal wall insulation. I think we put 100mm of phenolic foam in wrapping those walls. And that's the cost of it. So that's why I've introduced this case study, really, because it's kind of not a huge amount of money. It's still 13 or so thousand. And we actually funded this through a government scheme that we had some money to do some capital works on various houses in Brighton. And back in the day, the energy company obligation was a little bit more accessible, and we got quite a meaningful contribution from that fund as well. So the actual cost, I think, turned out to be just over 11,300 or something like that. Eco, in theory, should be quite easy to get, but in practice, it's now very, very difficult. So finally, this is a kind of checklist of things just to consider if you want to do your own home. They're kind of questions that you might want to ask yourself and things to consider, really. The first and foremost is, how much money do I have above and beyond what I might be spending? What are my priorities? Am I really interested in a very healthy environment? Am I really going to consider kind of natural, sort of low impact materials? Is disruption a real issue? So in that case, it might be that I want to design a plan of works that doesn't interrupt my lifestyle too much, because I'll be living in the property the whole time that work's being carried out. And that is definitely something to consider. We've done projects with people moving out and people staying put. And I'd say generally the people moving out are probably slightly happier than those staying put. But it might not be the case that you can move out your house for a couple of months, so it's worth considering the timescale. It's also worth thinking about whether there are complications. Do you live in a conservation area? Is it difficult to get access to your house for scaffolding and stuff like that? Think about different ways that you can get money. Think about your time frame. Is it something I'd like to do little bits of over a very long period of time? Or is it something I'd actually rather just move out for a few months and just get everything done and just move back in and then life's rosy again? And then think about these different things and what are the priorities. Is insulating your house a priority? Do you really need a new set of windows? Is that a priority? Is your boiler about to give up? Is that a priority? Or indeed, have you got a bit of spare cash and you've done most of the other things, and fitting renewable energy is kind of the next thing for you? So in conclusion, every house is a potential retrofit, and there's lots of ways to do it. There's no really one prescribed way of doing it. The key point really is to just think about what barriers there might be stopping you and enabling you to not do it, and to try and take those away. There's a very good event. We've been running Eco Open Houses in Brighton and Hove. Transition Town Worthing are running an event in Worthing on the 18th and 19th of April. Lots of great houses being opened up there. And also we've got the Eco Renovation course in November as well, if you'd like to find out a little bit more. I have to say, all of our courses are designed in such a way that there's a kind of practical component, a theoretical component, and a visioning component. And I think what I quite like about this course is towards the end of the day, in the morning we focus on a range of different techniques and approaches, and then we go off to have a look around the house, and then people just get to vision how they might apply all of those things to their own situation. So I quite like that. I think it's good for people to visualise stuff. Maybe I'm just a bit of a hippie, but there you go. So yeah, if anyone's got any questions, thanks a lot for listening. And
Thank you, Mischa. We've got time for a couple of questions, maybe. Oh, lots of questions. I ignore that dodgy character in the front row. Just gentleman with the beard.
Thanks very much. It touches on some work that Duncan's done, but it's the question of the sort of amount of work and time and money needed to renovate properties versus new builds, in terms of the amount of energy saved and therefore carbon emissions too. So, well, you've got these sort of thoughts about that. I'm thinking of that 13,000 bill for that, and the savings of 500 a year. So it's a long payback time, but also it's not a great carbon reduction, it seems to me.
yeah, a lot of people have put a lot of time and thought into that question. Should we just ball and chain it all and start again, perhaps in rammed earth, perhaps in straw bale, and perhaps a combination of the both? The fact is, we've got 24, 25 million houses in this country. The rate of renewal we have is very small. We renew probably about 24,000 houses a year. So given those figures, and they are averages, it would probably take about 1,000 years to renew the stock. Now, we could take the view that actually we're going to go down a massive programme of demolition and rebuild. But it's not popular, it's not a vote winner, and frankly, it's never going to happen. So my view really is we've got to really consider what we're going to do with the houses we've got. We've got this overall target from the Climate Change Act of reducing our carbon emissions from the UK economy by 80% by 2050. Most of the houses that are standing today will be standing in 2050. So we have to come up with a sensible way of tackling them, really. My other thought on it really is if you consider the energy invested already in that property, energy been and gone and spent, then doing up the property makes a lot more sense really than taking it to bits, perhaps using some components of it, but basically building another house or an estate of houses where those houses were previously. However low impact materials you use, the build process consumes a lot of energy in the construction of the materials. It consumes a lot of energy in the construction of the building. It will also consume a lot of water. By the time you factor in all of those things, you're suddenly building in a huge amount of carbon debt into just renewing a property that you could spend a small amount of money. £13,000 is a lot of money, but if you consider the average price of a new build house, it's a fraction of it really. So my thoughts would always be reuse, rebuild wherever you can. And then if you can't, sometimes buildings reach the end of their useful life sometimes, and that's a good time to perhaps dismantle them and reuse the materials wherever you can. But new build, yeah, it's good for some situations. Sorry if I've laboured the question.
Thank you.
Roland?
It's just kind of following on from that. We've shown quite a lot of phenolic stuff from lovely Kingspan, whether you have a view on the difference between using natural materials and oil and metallic-based materials.
Perhaps everyone can't hear the question as well. I should have pointed it out before. So.
Yes, I'll repeat the question. The question essentially comes down to what are my thoughts on natural and unnatural materials, or organic materials as they call them, petroleum-based materials. I guess I have a range of views. I've used quite a lot of these different materials, both natural and organic, on a range of properties. Really, for me, it comes down to what's practical. How much money does someone have? And indeed, how much insulation can we get into the property? The project that we actually worked on with this house here, we did a number of other houses as well that actually abutted a public highway, and we actually insulated the front of those. And we actually working with the council, we got stuff changed so that you could oversail the public highway without having to worry about all the usual licensing that previously was in place, up to 100 millimetres. So looking at the actual thermal performance of different insulation products, natural products tend to be performing, I would say, to a certain level. Phenolic tends to perform about twice as good, and there are others that perform better. And so in that situation, that's the material we chose to use. I would generally err on the side of natural materials if A, there is the budget to pay for it, and B, it's practical to do so, is my view in a nutshell. Ball and chain it all and build it with rammed earth. Forget insulation, there's no value in it. I'm sorry, that's a very trite remark.
A final question over there.
Me.
Yes, sorry.
We used to get cavity wall insulation in our house, and it caused immediate damp problems. We had to pay to take the wall back out again. You brushed past cavity wall insulation. What do you think?
I think that's a very common experience, and
Sorry, can you repeat that?
sorry, the question was to do with issues that arise, unintended consequences when using cavity wall insulation to fill a cavity. It's a big problem, and it's a common problem. The way the cavity wall works is that the outer leaf is a rain screen, and the inner leaf of bricks is more or less the structure. And the idea being that the cavity is always vented so that the rain screen gets wet over time and dries out and so on. There's no problems with that. Obviously, as soon as you fill it, you're giving the moisture, the rain that's penetrating into the outer leaf, the opportunity to migrate across into the building, and that can be a problem if you live in an exposed location. There can be other problems as well with brick ties. There can be lots of problems as well with rising damp coming into the cavity and coming through. It is complicated. Unfortunately, a lot of people that do cavity wall installation, I would suggest, don't perhaps survey the property in as much detail as they can, or they should. And if you are considering cavity wall installation, look at where you are very closely before undertaking the work. And make sure as well, it's not so much of a problem now, but when people first started insulating cavities kind of 25, 30 years ago, they used to blow material in that couldn't be removed. Most of them now tend to be small beads. But whatever you fill it with, make sure it's something that can be removed. So if you do experience problems, then at least you can get the material out. But the overarching point is, before doing any treatment of a building or intervention on a building, particularly with walls, it's absolutely crucial to deal with any underlying issues that might be there, because adding energy efficiency interventions into a building will not correct any underlying issues, and it's dealing with those first. That's the crucial, vital thing. Not necessarily. Moisture in buildings is quite a complicated subject, and it doesn't necessarily have to. In that instance, there was stuff applied to stop moisture actually going into it, and the product that was probably used on your house, I doubt it wouldn't be the same as this. It would be a completely different material. It was probably a small polystyrene bead, so it's difficult to say really. I don't know what product was used, but the point is, even if it was a natural material, it would still be providing a path of moisture from the outside to the in. And the difference actually between the natural and the organic material is if you use the natural material and it gets wet and it degrades, it composts. Whereas the other, because heat and moisture and organic material equals compost. So if that natural material will just degrade, whereas the organic material, the artificial petroleum-based material, won't. I'm not saying it's better. I'm just making an observation of how both of those different materials deal with moisture. I'm sorry to hear you've had a problem. It is very common that lots of people have issues with cavity wall. It's such an obvious thing. People say just fill the cavity, and so people do, and then there's always problems. So nothing's ever simple.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Mischa.
It's my pleasure.
So